Mr. President, officers of the King's African Rifles and East African Forces Association, gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to speak at the 67th dinner of the association. I do feel especially privileged to be asked in this, the centenary year of the outbreak of the war to end all war, in which the regiment played such a very courageous and skillful role. I'd better say at the outset, or repeat, that it is the East Africa campaign that I've been instructed to talk about. So if anyone was hoping to hear tales of the campaigns against the Mad Mullah, for example, I, for one, won't be at all offended if you want to sit out the next few minutes in the bar. A friend once told me of a similar mix-up when he went to a grand dinner for Lloyd's of London, and somebody hadn't properly briefed the comedian who came to deliver the after-dinner entertainment. And he opened by telling an increasingly obscene string of jokes about black horses. And of course it suddenly occurred to everyone after this that he'd confused Lloyd's of London, the insurance market, with Lloyd's Bank. He wasn't asked back the next year. I hope I might be asked back if I behave myself. Now, I'm very aware that tonight I'm among the cognoscenti, or conoscenti. Many of you have been very kind to share memories of family members and relations and to direct inquiries in my direction, and it's certainly helped me in my work enormously. It's also very much helped me to maintain my enthusiasm for this extraordinary campaign in East Africa. But beyond the bounds of these walls, the mention of the Great War in Africa tends to be met with a blankly quizzical look. It may, if one is fortunate, prompt recall of some amusing or even absurd incident. There's occasionally an awareness of an incident of extraordinary heroism, but there's seldom any grasp of the sheer scale of the campaign. So, for example, let's just remind ourselves before we go into that you might hear somebody joking about that famous scout in Major Sos Cohen's unit who sent the telegram saying, "Encountered enemy patrol of 14, stop, what shall I do with MGs, stop." Or the stories of settlers painting grey ponies with stripes to make them look like zebras. I mean, I never understood quite the point of that one anyway. There are also the stories of the great eccentricities, or the eccentricities of the great commander Spicer Simpson, who led the naval expedition so crucial to the taking of Lake Tanganyika that then involved the Belgians to join the fray by advancing into German East Africa from the west. One might, for example, hear what a formidable adversary von Lettow-Vorbeck was. One might hear how Generalmajor Kurt Wahl was still in the field in 1918, having been caught in German East Africa visiting his son on the outbreak of war. Wahl had commenced his military service in 1867, 3 years before von Lettow-Vorbeck was born. These are perhaps, stories with which some of us are familiar. There's the China affair, the extraordinary incident when Berlin decided to send one of its 20 precious Zeppelins that were engaged at the time in a major campaign of bombing London, to send one to attempt to resupply the German forces in East Africa. It didn't make it, but it is an extraordinary episode. Some people are familiar with Major Pete Pretorius's antics in reconnoitring the Rufiji Delta and also the extraordinary skill with which the naval monitors Mersey and Severn were commanded in that operation, and the extraordinary courage of the Royal Naval Air Service airmen, who really were the first to engage in the sort of reconnaissance of naval vessels in any theatre in the Great War. There was, of course, let's remind ourselves, disaster, most notably at Tanga in the early months of the war, when an Allied force, British and Indian force, of just over 8,000 men attempted an amphibious operation, and in the scale of the disaster, in relative terms, it perhaps presaged what was going to happen the following summer in the Dardanelles. The lessons of Tanga had not been learned. All in all, for the first 2 years of the campaign, it's fair to say that the impression back here in London, as the Colonial Secretary Harcourt said in one particular memo, was that what was happening in East Africa was all very thrilling. Now, these stories have their place. That some are amusing, some are heartrending, but I would argue strongly that they are only snapshots. And if they have been allowed to become predominant in the popular imagination, then I hope that we will all continue to seek to counter that predominance at every opportunity. And in this, the centenary of the outbreak of war, I think this is one such opportunity. Because if these snapshots predominate, it obfuscates the grim reality of the campaign to the detriment of the memory of those who fought and suffered in it. And I would include civilians, because it is very important that we remember that African civilians, in an area of operations approximately 3.5 times the size of the German Reich, suffered on an unimaginable scale compared to all but pockets of civilians in Europe. We're all familiar, I think, with the famines of 1917 and 18, and with the exigencies of carrier service, for example. But there was, of course, at the death knell, the final tragedy was the Spanish influenza epidemic, which was able to travel up the lines of communication established with such care by the military authorities at such a rapid rate that approximately 1.5 million to 2 million Africans died in the influenza epidemic right at the end of 1918. To put that in context, that's 1.5 to 2 times the total population of Nyasaland, Malawi, at the time. But I digress slightly. By depicting the realities of the campaign, I think that we can also show that this was more than a mere sideshow. I'm never quite sure when I read the word sideshow whether this is a simple observation on scale or whether it's tainted with a slight pejorative sense. And certainly in many references of the time and later, there was an element that this was somehow irrelevant, minor, or whatever. Now, while the East African campaign certainly, obviously, did not determine the outcome of the Great War in total, it was nevertheless a campaign of importance, as one contemporary historian put it. And as such, I would like to just talk a little bit about the realities of the campaign for the majority who took part in this, a year of special remembrance. At this gathering, perhaps rather than think about Tanga and so forth, let us remember, because few others are likely to, the battle at Mahiwa and Nyangao, in October 1917. This was the most vicious engagement of 4 years of fighting. It took place, for anyone unfamiliar with the geography, which I should think is only a few of you, but just inland from Lindi, the port of Lindi, in southern Tanganyika, German East Africa, Tanzania, as the German forces, led by von Lettow-Vorbeck, were making a bid to cross into Portuguese East Africa. Now, at this battle, the most vicious of the entire war, 6 battalions of King's African Rifles took part. Casualties among the 5,000 strong British Imperial contingent ranged regiment by regiment between 1/3 and 1/2. 1-2 King's African Rifles lost half its British officers and NCOs and 1/3 of the Askari. The German forces, although possibly besting it slightly on the field, were robbed of any offensive capability whatsoever after this, because in 4 days 2,000 maximum troops had expended 850,000 rounds of ammunition. In the thick bush around Mahiwa and Nyangao, I think we can all just imagine the pandemonium and what a very, very intense and frightening scrap, inverted commas, this was. Let us also remember, because again I think few will, almost a year later, the 2 battles a week apart in Portuguese East Africa at Leoma and Pere Hills. These, again, to paint a picture on the map, are just about parallel with the bottom end of Lake Nyasa, or with Zomba, the former station of the President, and 1 KAR. At this stage of the campaign, von Lettow-Vorbeck, having run a merry round through northern Portuguese East Africa, was attempting to make it back into German East Africa. And at Leoma, 1 KAR formed a square and meant to block him. By this time, the King's African Rifles were the absolute backbone of the Allied forces left in the field. With about 8 battalions in Portuguese East Africa, it varied slightly, but most of the time 8, they were required to pursue this enemy through an area of operations 2/3 the size of France. Now, in the bump at Leoma and Pere Hills, there were 28 awards of the African Distinguished Conduct Medal to the Askari of the King's African Rifles. This was 50% of the total awarded for the whole year of fighting in Portuguese East Africa. It was 1/6 of the number 178, I think, although Christopher might correct me, awarded to the King's African Rifles during the whole campaign. Some of the citations, which I went back to look at again this week in advance of this evening, really do raise goosebumps. There are countless references to Askari getting their officers out of the field when wounded. Acting CSM Lita, his citation reads that he repeatedly asked permission to be allowed to charge under most heavy machine gun fire. Scout Corporal Quenja, when pursuing von Lettow-Vorbeck as he made his way north after the main battle, encountered von Lettow-Vorbeck's rearguard 7 times in an advance of 11 miles. I should also mention that the commanding officers of 1-1, 1-2 and 3-2 King's African Rifles were also all awarded the DSO for the action at Leoma and Pere Hills. The regimental historian perhaps summed it up best of all by calling this very little known engagement a battle in which the courage, initiative and leadership of the African NCOs were seen at their best. It's telling also, perhaps in connection with this battle, that the normally taciturn and prone to slight exaggeration of his own brilliance in parts, von Lettow-Vorbeck, called these battles pretty violent. He lost 15%, of a really very diminishing force by that point, and was so alarmed by the engagement and the strength with which the KAR had engaged him that he led his columns 200 miles in the following 3 weeks in an attempt to put clear bush between him and the King's African Rifles battalions he'd left to recover at Leoma and Pere Hills. He could not, quite simply, afford another similar encounter. I hope that this gives some impression, or reminds those of you who know, of what the fighting was really like, particularly in 1917 and 1918. But it has to be said, for the King's African Rifles, pretty much from day one. It is, I'm sure, well known to many of you that, as one of the colonels, the regimental battalion colonels, said of the fighting, there is no form of warfare that requires so much inherent pluck in the individual as bush fighting. But let's also remind ourselves of the general conditions, not just the ferocity of the battles. This, above all, for the troops, was a war of endurance. Colonel Brian Hawkins's 1-4 KAR covered 1,830 miles in 6 months in 1918. This was not by motor car. Also in 1918, Katu Kol, 2 battalions of King's African Rifles, covered 1,600 miles in 7 months, fording 29 large rivers and fighting 32 engagements. In July alone, they covered 330 miles, virtually without rations. I think it's entirely fitting that a King's African Rifles battalion, 1-4, fought the last action, as far as I'm aware, by a British Army unit anywhere in the Great War. It took place on the 12th of November, the day after the armistice in Europe, at the River Malema, as von Lettow-Vorbeck sought to punch his way through northern Rhodesia to who knows where. In addition to the endurance required, the greatest threat perhaps to life, even greater than the fighting, was disease. Von Lettow-Vorbeck opened the campaign with 63 highly trained medical officers who had fortuitously been in the colony, most of them conducting a sleeping sickness campaign. These were to prove one of his most valuable assets in terms of being able to keep men in the field and healthy. I'm afraid to say that the British medical support was scandalous, and I use that word advisedly because the Pike report in 1917 that looked into the provision of medical care to those wounded and sick on the front was deemed a scandal. In particular, let's think here again of the carriers. At a time when there were several 100,000 being employed, there were only 13,000 beds for carriers, and none of them were within reach of the front lines. So essentially these people were being committed to battle with absolutely no prospect of being saved if anything went wrong. I could use statistics from a King's African Rifles battalion, but instead I'll use the Gold Coast Regiment, with whom KAR units fought with great comradeship. The Gold Coast Regiment came to this campaign 3,800 all ranks, suffered casualties of 50%. Of those killed in action were 215, died of disease 270, invalided 567. Above all, this was a campaign against Africa, against nature. The disease threat of assumes an even greater proportion because there was no respite. This was a theatre of war with no comforts. There were no newspapers. There were no cigarettes. There was no organised R&R, as you might have in the Western Front. When newspapers did arrive, they were 5 months old. The real problem was supply. Northeast supply lines on the northern Rhodesia front stretched back to Durban. They were the longest of any British military unit in the Great War. So all you could put down these supply lines was food. That was the only thing that there was sufficient capacity to carry. Hawthorne's King's African Rifles battalions by the end, were never on full rations during 1916 for more than 2 or 3 days at a time. This is a war in which the privations endured by the troops and those who supported them were almost unimaginable. It's telling, perhaps, let's use a voice or listen to a voice from outside an African regiment. It's an officer of the 40th Pathans who had served on the Western Front, who wrote during 1917, "What wouldn't one give for the food alone in France, for the clothing and equipment, for the climate, wet or fine?" The askari of the King's African Rifles battalions who'd pursued von Lettow-Vorbeck through Portuguese East Africa were, as one of their senior officers said, when they were stripped as they recrossed the Rovuma River back into German East Africa, they were stripped for inspection, and he said they looked like the victims of famine. I'd like to end with 2 points and perhaps one slightly scurrilous question. The first point is that I think we really do need to continue trying to dispel the myth that this was a minor campaign. It wasn't minor in terms of geography. We've talked about the colossal size of the area of operations. It wasn't minor in terms of cost. Although no final figure was ever put on this, it was strongly sensed and actually declared in the Cape Times in 1919 that the total cost to the British and Indian treasuries and South African of this campaign exceeded that of the Boer War. Now, the Boer War, or Anglo-South African War, was, in the words of the great Thomas Pakenham, the most prodigal conflict since the Napoleonic Wars. So I'm just indulging here in perhaps a little comparing like for like. This was the greatest conflict that had ever taken place on African soil to that point. it certainly wasn't minor when we consider the casualties. 126,000 British and Imperial troops took to the field during the campaign, and more than 1 million military carriers. The deaths were greater than 105,000 men. Now, to put that in context, that is very nearly double the death toll suffered by Indian troops in the First World War, by Australian troops, and by Canadian troops, the memory of whom is perhaps, to my mind anyway, altogether more prominent than that of the African troops and those who supported them. The only way you can write off this campaign as being small in terms of casualties is if you don't count the lives of the carriers as human lives. And that is something that I personally feel very strongly about. This isn't indulging in a bit of historical revisionism. Even at the time, the great General Northey, one of the finest commanders in the field, said, "I would award the palm of merit to the carriers, without whom this campaign could not have been fought." So those who had been in the field with these civilians, who were required to tramp up to 30 miles a day with packs of 50, 60 pounds, not in nice neat shapes, but sometimes a wheel or something even more uncomfortable, for months on end, with no medical care and on scant rations, they must be remembered too. And had they been on the Western Front, they would have been remembered. They could not have been forgotten. My second point is, I'll introduce with the remark of one colonel from a King's African Rifles battalion who said of his askari, "They do not know what fear means. They have won the war for us in East Africa." For my money, and it's only a personal view, Hawthorne, Gifford, or Gifford, I don't know the correct way of pronouncing it, please forgive me, and various others of the commanders of the King's African Rifles battalions in 1917 and 18 and earlier were absolutely the match as individual commanders for von Lettow-Vorbeck. But beyond the confines of this association and perhaps related associations, their names are no longer familiar. Outside, beyond the regiment, let's remember as well Northey, Rose of the Gold Coast Regiment, the great Irishmen Hannington and O'Grady, who had fought at Mahiwa and Nyangao. These were really top-notch leaders of men. But as I say, who outside this room remembers those names today? I think as we remember the askari and we remember the carriers, let us also, of course, remember the officers. My scurrilous question, to finish off. By the end of the campaign, the KAR was about 35,000 all ranks. What might have happened if the expansion of the regiment had started earlier, as had been proposed, and if Hoskins had not been replaced by the South African Van der Venter for political reasons in mid-1917 and had been able to complete his complete reorganisation of the forces in this gigantic theatre undisturbed. You see, I think, and there's also a typist in Hoskins's office who believed the same, and I'm sure he was not alone, that Hoskins might have got von Lettow-Vorbeck. and put paid to the untold misery of 1918. Thank you.